friends, welcome back to the Stormy Grace YouTube Academy. I'm your teacher today, Mal, and I'm so excited to be diving into one of my favorite subjects, which is unpacking the midheaven. And one of the goals of my presentation today was to really expand on the midheaven and talk about how the midheaven, yes, can talk about what we do, our work life, our career, but also going a bit deeper and going more into the spiritual and the soul kind of level of what the midheaven can carry. So I'm really excited to share some of these ideas with you all. And by the time that you will be seeing this video, some of you have been studying through the Stormy Grace YouTube Academy for about a year. So this presentation, I want it to challenge you, and I want it to allow you the opportunity to practice some synthesis, some chart synthesis, which is really exciting. So if you've been wanting to get some practice, this lesson will definitely help you out. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. So I called this presentation The Midheaven, Its Ruler, and Taking Up Your Sacred Space. And like I said, one of my goals for the class today is to explore some of the ways that the midheaven can delineate something about the way our soul is meant to take up space in this lifetime. Yes, it is about career, but it's more than that. It's something deeper. And there's many ways that we can take up space in this lifetime that don't necessarily have to do with what we do from 9 to 5, right? And that's why I believe I don't think any midheaven can tell us like, oh, this is written in the stars, you're going to be a doctor or you're going to be a lawyer or whatnot. But I think what the midheaven can share with us is how our souls are called to take up space. So that is really exciting, and we're going to be getting into how exactly to delineate this with the planets and the planetary rulers of the midheaven. But first, I just wanted to share a quick lesson inspiration with you, and that is the Emperor, which is a tarot card I sort of brought to this lesson today. And in addition to being a professional astrologer, I'm also a professional tarot reader and teacher. And I often like to see I like to see the connection between tarot and astrology. I think it's really cool. And sometimes when I'm doing some or teaching something astrological, the ideas that are presented in the tarot cards will really pop into my mind. And when I was sitting on the energy of the midheaven, the Emperor card was a card that really popped into my mind. And who is the Emperor in the tarot? Well, the Emperor talks about the way in which we claim our sacred space in this world. There's like a low frequency of the Emperor that we could relate to like capitalism or colonialism, right? Like this sort of idea of I'm going to conquer this territory or I'm going to claim this space. And, regardless of who was there before me, like it's mine and I'm declaring that this is mine, right? Like that could be a little bit more of a low frequency kind of emperor vibe. But in a really high frequency, a soul level frequency, we can think of the emperor as the energy that helps us recognize what we are here to do as individuals and the type of space, spirit, and our soul is beckoning us to take up. It's this sort of idea that if you don't take up your space, no one will, because what is meant for you can only be done by you, right? So if you are meant to invent some like out of this world contraption of sorts or something, like and you're the only person on this planet who has that idea and who has the skill set to bring this invention into life, then thus you're the only person who can actually make it, right? No one else is going to have that idea but you. So that's really what the emperor talks about. The emperor talks about like the bravery and the grit and even the gumption that it takes to really walk your path and claim your path as your own. And I think that's why the emperor also teaches us that there really is no such thing as competition, I think, in spirit's mind, because there's no competition if everybody is doing their soul work, right? Because doing your soul work has the connotation that you're helping others, and soul work is almost like an ecosystem where what you are giving helps another person, and what they exchange also helps you get what you need to get, and like everybody's needs are met in this sort of soul ecosystem, which is why this idea of like competition and fighting to the top and whatever, I think in the highest frequency of the emperor doesn't worry about that, right? So that brings me back to the midheaven. Okay, what does this have to do with the midheaven? Well, I think the midheaven very much relates to why and how and when and where we decide to take up our sacred space. How is our soul wanting to claim its sort of calling in this lifetime, if that makes any sense. So this is sort of my inspiration for this lesson today. But before we dive into just a quick review of the basics of the midheaven, a couple things I'll be taking for granted in this presentation. I'm going to be working with the whole sign system and also the traditional rulers, the traditional planetary rulers. I have absolutely nothing against the modern rulership scheme or quadrant house systems like Placidus. In fact, I consider them all the time in my practice, and I often find myself thinking like, okay, yeah, in the modern scheme, this Pisces sun is ruled by Neptune, but in the traditional scheme, this Pisces sun is ruled by Jupiter, right? So these are thoughts I always have, and yeah, I have a lot of respect for all different kinds of astrology, but just for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be taking it back to Hellenistic times. Okay, so buckle up and get your chart out in the whole sign system, because that will be the best use of our time together today. And also, I'm taking it a little bit for granted, like assuming that my audience knows a little something about the essential dignities. I know you all have learned something about the essential dignities from a previous class within Stormie's YouTube Academy. And I'm also assuming that all of my listeners have some basic knowledge about the houses as well. Okay, so those are some of the perspectives we'll be working within today. Okay, let's just do a quick overview of the angles. We'll do a quick review because I don't know how long it has been since you as a student have reviewed, yeah, what is the angle? What are the angles? What is the midheaven? And one of the really helpful ways that the angles have been framed for me actually comes from Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, a really great astrology book. And in that book, he talks about how the Hellenistic astrologers referred to the angles as kentron. And if we translate this Greek word into English, one of the ways we can translate it, kentron, is as the word pivot. And that there's something about hearing that that really clicked for me. I was like, oh, the angles, they're pivots. This is like really blowing my mind because open invitation, even if you stand up right now and start pivoting in place, that's a pretty profound way to shift your energy and perspective, right? Like if you pivoted to all four corners of the room that you're in right now, you'll see that with each pivot, you get an entirely new perspective and view of the space that you're in. And, understanding that the Hellenistic astrologers related the four angles to these pivoting points of the chart. That's really profound to me. It really speaks to the like intensity of these points in the chart, right? And even another way I like to kind of talk about the angles is kind of the idea of doing a U-turn. If you ever have done a U-turn, um, you got to check both ways. You got to make sure the police aren't around, and like you're and you're completely turning in a new direction. You're completely getting a new perspective once you turn that wheel. And I think when a planet actually transits one of our angles, if let's say Uranus goes over your ascendant, your midheaven, the descendant, or the IC, this could be as profound as taking a U-turn, as profound as pivoting in place, right? You get this entirely new perspective that the universe is giving you. And this is the power of a planet, especially an outer planet, transiting one of your angles, right? Like these big life moments, these big life shifts often happen when that happens, right? So really, the angles to me are the turning points of the chart. They're kind of the points that hold the whole chart together, right? And if we just zoom in on the midheaven specifically, what really is the midheaven? If the planets rise on the ascendant, the midheaven or the MC is the highest point a planet will reach in the sky on any given day. So it is where the planets culminate, right? And, I was planning on being an English teacher for a lot of my life and before I became an astrologer. And if you think back to like high school English class, your English teacher probably gave you like the story arc or the sort of format of how stories typically go, right? And you have something called the rising action, right? And then we get to the climax, and then we get to the falling action, and then the resolution. And most stories are formatted in this way. So we could actually think of the midheaven as that point in a story where we're like right between the rising action and the falling action. Like this is where the big drama happens. Like this is the climax of the story. This is the part of the story that is the most visible, the part of the story that everybody remembers. That can be likened to the midheaven, right? Because the midheaven is where the energy of the day culminates, right? And I think too, when we are studying astrology, I think astrology is really the study of opposites and how opposites interact with one another. So we can't really talk about the midheaven unless we also bring in, what is the IC, which is the angle directly across from the midheaven, right? And the IC, and I'll show you on this picture here, just in case, that the IC is our place that is underground in the chart, right? It can talk about our homeland, where we call home, our private life, what goes on behind closed doors, but also our ancestral lineage and our ancestral wounds that we might carry in this lifetime, the stories that have been passed down for better or for worse to us from our parents, our grandparents, etc., etc., right? So, there's a lot of like, um, again, Chris Brennan calls this line the subterraneous or the subterraneous. I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation, but like the subterranean um, point of the chart, this sort of place that is underground and can't be seen. So if that is the IC, and we're talking about the opposite of the IC, which is the midheaven. Oh, hang on. This is a place that is the least private, the most public. Does the MC have something to do with our parents still? Sure, absolutely. I think both the MC, IC, fourth house, 10th house very much have to do with our parents. And how, we were conditioned to act or behave. But I think the MC is a little bit more about how we were conditioned to behave publicly, right? And it can have a lot to do with how we carry the legacy of our parents and ancestors into our lifetime as well. But it's also my feeling, if the midheaven is opposite to the IC, and the IC is about, or can be about, our ancestral stories, even sometimes our ancestral trauma, um, the narratives that we are carrying. I also think that MC can maybe be a point in the chart that helps us break free and break out of some of these ancestral narratives that we no longer need to be carrying as souls, right? So let's say there's a profound narrative of scarcity in your family for good reason, because let's say let's say your parents or your grandparents are first generation immigrants and they came to, let's say, America with almost nothing, and they really had to watch their money and operate from this place of scarcity for basically their whole lives, right? And let's say you now, being a second or third generation American, let's say you're popping. You have a job. You went to college. You got your own car. You've got your apartment, whatever it is. And let's say you do have more than enough, but then you wake up in the middle of the night paralyzed with fear that everything's going to be taken away from you. That's very much an example of how our ancestral stories live inside of our hearts. But I think the midheaven can point to how we transmute these stories as individuals, how we heal our ancestors, right? And I think even like being seen and being public for our talents and being seen for our gifts and bringing our gifts into this world, I think that can be profoundly healing just in general, right? Because for so many of us, maybe we come from family lineages or stories where it was shameful or it was, not right to show up in a really unique way. Like maybe the goal was to just fit in and not be seen and put your head down and not cause a ruckus. And children are meant to be seen and not heard, right? And like if we have that kind of thing going on in like our unconscious, right? I think the midheaven can be a way we break through that energy and we kind of bring our true individualized self into the public. And I'm not a therapist, or I am not a psychoanalyst or anything. But I kind of also think about the concept of psychological separation with the midheaven, which is this idea that in each person's life, there will be a point where we must psychologically separate from our parents. And this typically happens maybe around the teenage years, when teenagers start getting really angsty and like they're like, I'm not doing that, mom, or like I'm going to my friend's house, dad, and like they're trying to rebel. What the psyche is really doing is trying to separate from the parents, because that is how we survive, right? As like a human species. And but oftentimes, because of our wounding, and I think also because of perhaps codependent patterns, trauma stories that exist within our family systems, some of us aren't able to psychologically separate from our parents that easily, right? We can typically do that if we have a secure attachment formed with our parents. That means psychological separation is a little bit easier. But if there's insecure attachment with our caretakers, this act of becoming an individual and claiming the sacred space and being seen and heard for your unique gifts, that might be more of a challenge that is thus being spoken about by the midheaven. Okay, so again, I'm not a therapist. These are just things that I've kind of thought about, like how we can maybe relate the midheaven to a little bit more of like a psychological reading. And just some midheaven keywords: authority, leadership, our public reputation, putting our stake in this world, claiming our space in this world. I also think that the midheaven may kind of beckon us to come up with our own definition of success. If the fourth house and 10th house do allude to um, the conditioning that our parents instilled in us, like maybe there's a part of our midheaven that's like, oh yeah, that's how my mom taught me I should be successful. Success is a number that's in your bank account, right? So the midheaven may challenge us with that conditioning to define our own like kind of definition of success, right? I also kind of relate the word integrity to the midheaven. And I think that the midheaven shows us like, where I think integrity is really just honesty, right? And when we honestly show up in this world as the imperfect beings that we are, we often are seen more in a way, because people may be attracted to our honesty or our integrity, or just relate to us on a more authentic level. I also think authenticity could also be a keyword for the midheaven. So some maybe lower frequency midheaven themes: imposter syndrome, not being kind of insecure about taking up space. Uh, on the other hand, control, power, and domination. If we have planets conjunct the midheaven, especially things like Mars or Pluto, or even Saturn, we might have a theme of our power being taken away from us at some point. And we may kind of maybe unconsciously boomerang that energy, into our adult lives. And in order to get our power back from our childhood, we start to want to dominate and control others unconsciously. So that could very much be a theme of the midheaven. Conditioning. I think like a Napoleon or inferiority complex could also be somewhat related to the midheaven. And maybe overcompensation for our insecurities, right? Because if the fourth house is where our private life happens, and like the things that happen behind closed doors, that's the fourth house, then perhaps sometimes in the 10th house and by the midheaven, this is where we sort of overcompensate for those insecurities within the fourth house, right? Like, for instance, within the fourth house, if someone was told as a child that they were unattractive, or that they weren't lovable because of a certain physical feature, how does that show up in the midheaven, then maybe this person becomes known for being in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most plastic surgery ever had. Or again, I'm making this up, but you can see how what happens on the IC kind of boomerangs into the MC in a really interesting way. Okay. So one thing important to note when we're looking at the midheaven in the whole sign house system, in comparison, you might be used to seeing the midheaven in a quadrant house system like Placidus. And sometimes we tend to think of the midheaven as something on the cusp of not something, just the cusp of the 10th house, right? But in the whole house system, the MC can potentially land outside of the 10th house. And why is this? Well, if we think about it, the MC and the IC are dependent on, the degree of the ascendant and descendant, right? So the MC becomes a specific degree of the zodiac at the top of the chart that shifts according to the ascendant axis. So as the ascendant descendant axis shifts, the degree of the midheaven and IC will also shift. And this is why in the whole house system, the midheaven could potentially show up in the 9th house, 10th house, 11th house, even the 12th house, 8th house I've seen before. And I actually really love that. I mean, if you're used to Placidus, that might kind of throw you off a little bit, but for me, it just adds like another layer of meaning to the person's life. And let's say the MC does land in the 9th house or the 10th house the 9th house or the 11th house. We could say that the themes of the 9th house or the themes of the 11th house become maybe more important in this native's lifetime. So if you're not used to seeing your chart in the whole house system, I would so encourage you just humor me. And just for the purpose of this presentation for the next hour, print or put your chart in the whole house system and see where your MC lands. Like you might have not even noted before, like, oh, in the whole house system, my MC is in the 9th house and all I've ever wanted to do is be a teacher, right? Like checks out, right? So definitely check it out, okay? And let's get into like now that we have the basics covered, right? Let's get into the sort of nitty-gritty how to delineate the midheaven. And this is really the meat of the presentation, because when we're talking about the midheaven and the planetary ruler of the midheaven, maybe we want to talk about some steps, some basic steps of how an astrologer or how you as a astrology student could go about practicing delineating the midheaven. Okay, and we're going to get into this in way more detail in a second, but I would say the first question we ask ourselves is just, where's the MC? Where's the midheaven? What sign is it in? What house is it in? Okay, so we're going to make a note of that. Okay, the MC's in Taurus in the 9th house. And then we're actually going to take note, what planet rules the MC? Okay, so if the planet if the MC is in Taurus in the 9th house, okay, what planet rules Taurus? That would be Venus. Okay, so we're writing down Venus. And that's when we then get into the essential dignities. So what's the condition of the ruler of the MC? Practice your essential dignities. Another way I think we can just think about the essential dignities is just thinking about, what's the story of this planet, right? Is this planet having some trouble? Is this planet suffering? Is this planet thriving? Is this planet thriving a little bit too much? Like, it's just really the story of what the planet is doing, right? So also something I'll take note of is, are there planets conjunct the midheaven? And are there aspects to the midheaven from other planets, especially from the second or sixth house? Just because when we're talking about the midheaven as a point that can talk about career and public reputation, some other places in the chart that can also talk about career are the second and sixth house, because the second house is the house of livelihood, and the sixth house is about like our daily schedule and our work life and our coworkers and, you know, how we are of service. So these are our other kind of subcategory career houses, right? So we're actually just going to practice this, and I'm going to show you this in real time. So if you're not getting it quite yet, I think you will by the end of this, by the end of these examples, because we're going to go through every single planet. And we're going to talk about how this planet takes up space as the ruler of the MC, how this planet acts when they get the chance to be the emperor, to be the ruler of the MC, to claim their space in this world. What happens? What happened? How does this planet start to show up in the native's life? Okay. So let's get into the sun and how the sun takes up space as the ruler of the midheaven. So again, for the sun to be the ruler of the midheaven, we would have to have a Leo midheaven, right? Because the sun rules Leo. So if you have a Leo midheaven, make sure to take note of where your sun is in your chart, what sign, what house, because the sun is going to be a lot about how you take up space in this world, how you're claiming your sacred space, and even how you are perhaps healing ancestral stories that no longer serve, you know, your current lifetime, right? And I think the sun as a planet, what does the sun do when it takes up space? I think it beckons us to think about things like thematics, stories, archetypes, the power of underlying themes when it comes to characters, not only us as the main character of our own lives, but it also calls us to think about how different characters in our lives, like our parents or our siblings or our boss or our teacher, how these characters affect us. So the sun really kind of puts us in the perspective of, I'm the main character of my play or of my story. However, in order for me to be the main character of my story, other people are around me and other people are like kind of triggering me and inspiring me to live out my story, right? So I think the sun as the ruler of the midheaven for Leo midheavens, where they're really wanting to take up space, I think, is in their own individuality, but also their relationships to others as well. I think also Leo midheavens are making things visible. If we think of the sun as a planet, right? And I know it's technically a star, but in astrological terms, we call it a planet. So the sun as a planet is light. It is the reason we are alive on Earth today. It's the reason that plants grow, that I'm alive, that I'm giving this presentation right now, right? The sun illuminates darkness. So that could be very much how you know, the sun acts as the ruler of the midheaven. This person with the Leo midheaven may be especially drawn to the act of illuminating, to the act of investigating what is beneath the surface and bringing it to light. And I also think because of the illuminating energies of the sun, I think Leo midheavens are particularly gifted in illuminating and imagining a new way forward that hasn't exactly been thought of yet. Because I think the sun really harnesses that true individual power of creation, right? And I think out of I mean everybody in some sense is a creator. That's one of my favorite things that Julia Cameron says from The Artist's Way. If you've ever read that book, it's an excellent book. It, this idea that we are all creators, but that's something that like the sun would say, right? I'm not completely sure of Julia Cameron's uh, natal chart, but the sun says like you are meant to create your own unique path. You're meant to be seen as your own unique power. You're meant to exercise your individual like charisma and energy in this lifetime, right? So Leo midheavens may have this strong theme of their own individual creation or inspiring other people to go on the path of their own individual creation or both, right? And of course, I think the sun can also talk about like the self or the ego or just how the mind works in general. So, like these topics of like human intelligence and psychology, again, that relates to the illumination of what's beneath the surface. These are things that Leo midheavens may be gifted at when it comes to taking up space. Okay. And my example of a Leo midheaven is Freud, right? So actually, I couldn't have dreamt of a better example for a Leo midheaven. And we look, okay, Freud has his midheaven at 23 degrees Leo. Who's the ruler of Leo? The sun. And where is Freud's sun? In the whole sign system, Freud's sun is at 16 degrees Taurus in the seventh house. Okay, so we're really looking at, okay, how is Freud really public with this sun in Taurus in the seventh house? How is Freud taking up their sacred space with the sun in Taurus in the seventh house? How is Freud illuminating things with the sun in Taurus in the seventh house, right? And Freud is most popularly known as the father of psychoanalysis, right? And what is psychoanalysis? Well, psychoanalysis is this idea that there is beneath the conscious mind, there is all of this like unconscious soup, right? So I put a little picture of like one of Freud's really famous ideas of like the id, the ego, the superego. And we can see in this sort of iceberg um, picture, we can see that the conscious mind, the tip of the iceberg, is only like a little bit out of the water, and the rest of our mind is completely unconscious. And it really kind of speaks to just how much we as humans operate from an unconscious place and don't even know it. And it like makes me excited because this is exactly something a Leo midheaven would be known for, illuminating a place that has not been illuminated before, right? And what Freud really did as the father of psychoanalysis, although we could argue that shamans and medicine women and there's been many wise people in this world, even in ancient times, that probably had or definitely had some kind of idea that humans operate in this way. But we'll say for the presentation's sake, okay, Freud is the one who develops and puts a label on it, right? A psychoanalysis. Again, that's a very sun thing to do. I have this unique idea and I'm claiming it as my own, okay? I also think relating that idea of the sun in Taurus in the seventh house as the place where Freud is taking up space in this lifetime, it kind of reminds me of how the seventh house is kind of about other people and how others project onto us what we project onto others, right? And it reminds me of the one of the famous concepts that Freud came up with, which is this idea of transference, which is something that us astrologers and therapists, try to be aware of in our sessions with our clients, right? Because transference can definitely happen. And what is transference? So this definition comes from the APA dictionary. But in psychoanalysis, a patient's displacement or projection onto the analyst of those unconscious feelings and wishes, originally directed towards important individuals, such as parents in the patient's childhood. Okay. So in English, what is transference? Really, transference is when we, unconsciously project perhaps like our childhood issues, our mommy issues, daddy issues, whatever it is, onto other people. I think a really basic example of this, when you were a little kid in school, how many of you had a moment where you called your teacher mom, right, on accident? Like again, like a very easy example to explain transference. Another easy example of transference would be, let's say, you know, I don't know, you have mommy issues or something. And I hope no, I'm being facetious, so I hope no one interprets me as being like insensitive. But let's say there's like some mommy issue themes that you have, and your new boss, is exactly the age of your mom and looks a lot like your mom. And you start to think, huh, she doesn't like me, or what did she mean by what she was saying, or what does like what does she mean by that? Is she mad at me? Is she You have these thoughts, and there may be is a day where you're like, wait a second. My boss is not my mom, right? Again, another kind of example of transference and projection, which are all themes that Freud kind of labeled, right, and popularized at least. And again, sun in the seventh house. What is the seventh house? Our relationship to others. So Freud really illuminated how we interact with other people. I think we'll move on to the next planet, but we could also talk about the Oedipus complex too with this whole placement, but maybe we'll save that for another day. I mean, I'm sure we could unpack Freud's chart for the rest of this presentation, but hopefully you get my vibe of how the sun ends up taking up space in this lifetime. Okay, let's move on to the moon. So, my Cancer midheavens. How are Cancer midheavens taking up space, claiming their sacred autonomy in this lifetime? The Cancer midheaven is all about having like the bravery to emotionally connect and expanding your emotional capacity. And Cancer midheavens, I think, are particularly good at transmuting fears, resentments, stagnated emotions. Even if you're a Cancer midheaven and you work like in a 9 to 5, let's say, in like a bank or like a relatively like unemotional um, environment, you could still kind of find yourself being in the place of needing to transmute someone's anxiety or listening to someone's stories or just holding space, because Cancer midheavens sometimes have these really incredible space holding natural counseling skills where people just feel safe with them to bring their challenges to, because they know the Cancer midheaven is able to transmute it in some way. And I also think Cancer midheavens, because they're ruled by the moon, or the moon rules their midheaven, sometimes they become known for their ability to intuitively sense the underlying energy of a project, right? Or the underlying energy of this one person in the office. Again, maybe you are working a 9 to 5 office job, but what you are really known for in the office, although you have excellent mathematical skills, what you're really known for in the office is the way you listen at the lunch table to your coworkers' issues, right? Or something along those lines. They become known for this empathic ability. And I also think Cancer midheaven's being ruled by the moon. The moon is about our memories, and I think Cancer midheavens have this talent to catalog, past the past and harnessing the wisdom from the past, when others may have so easily forgotten, right? I have some Cancer in my chart, and sometimes I'm kind of taken aback by how little people actually remember because I remember everything, right? Like I truly remember everything. So, that's actually a gift of the Cancer midheaven, right? The way that they're taking up space. This sort of idea that, we need to review and teach history so history doesn't repeat itself. I don't know really who said that, but whoever did might have very well had a Cancer midheaven, like this idea of cataloging history, the trials, the tribulations, and also the gifts and what went well. Cancer midheavens have this ability of the memory to help society grow and evolve, right? And also taking interest in the human emotions that go along with any situation. That's also how Cancer midheavens tend to be known when it comes to the moon being the ruler of their midheaven. And just in general, I find that Cancer midheavens really do need to feel an emotional connection to what they are doing in this world. They don't feel satisfied unless they leave their day feeling like they have helped or feeling like they at least made an emotional connection with someone. Okay. So my example for a Cancer midheaven is Laura Wasser, who is a relatively high-profile celebrity divorce lawyer. And you can see she has the midheaven at 28 degrees Cancer, ruled by the moon at 26 degrees Aries in the 7th house, conjunct the descendant, right? So how cool is that? The ruler of her midheaven is conjunct another angle, the descendant. And what is she known for? She's known to be a high profile celebrity divorce lawyer, right? And on the one hand, you hear this and you think, well, a celebrity divorce lawyer, that has nothing to do with what Mal just said, because Mal was just talking about, the emotional capacity and the empathy and the cataloging of the past, these gifts, these intuitive gifts that, Cancer midheavens have. How could a divorce lawyer be using that? But in different interviews that I've watched with Laura Wasser, she's very much invested in like the emotional journey of what divorce is, right? And she even wrote a book. And for me, this title of her book is so Cancer midheaven. So the title is "It Doesn't Have to Be That Way: How to Divorce Without Destroying Your Family or Bankrupting Yourself." Right? Okay. So again, like how to divorce without destroying your family. In that title, there's this emotional sensitivity to the energetic turmoil that divorce can cause, not only the people that are involved in the marriage, but also maybe the children, the family, the pets, whatever. Like this is a process that has very much to do with some of the deepest emotions we can experience. I've heard so many people describe divorce as the hardest thing they've ever been through, right? So to go through the hardest thing you've ever been through, you might want a Cancer midheaven to lead you through that, right? And I think this is probably why Laura Wasser became such a well-known lawyer, and has so many celebrity clients. I think she does her work as a divorce lawyer, sort of like a healer does their work in a way. And of course, I'm sure that being a divorce lawyer involves a lot of combing through the past, like what happened here, who owns this, who bought this, how many years have we been married, et cetera, to actually get to the sort of I don't know, the process of the law, when it comes to divorce and when it comes to dividing assets, that takes a lot of combing through the past, right? So again, this is how she's taking up space in this world. She's very good at combing through the past. And just having that moon in Aries conjunct the descendant, what is the descendant? The line of relationships. The moon in Aries being ruled by Mars, it's this idea of maybe being good at severing, being good at separation, right? Being good at the emotional process behind separation. Okay, so isn't that, I don't know, just this example really blows my mind. So that is Cancer midheaven for you. Now let's get into the Mercury as the ruler of the midheaven. How does Mercury take up space for Virgo and Gemini midheavens? Well, Mercury is, you know, Mercury takes up space in, I think, a lot of ways. Mercury tends to be a planet that does a lot of things, right? But I think Mercury is really, really good at summarizing evidence and data. It's really good at collecting data, collecting important data that is needed for a certain project or a certain goal or manifestation. That that Virgo Gemini midheaven, they are both ruled by Mercury, right? And they're going to have a gift for being able to collect the needed information or data, which doesn't sound that exciting, but data is why we get anything done, right? So we really couldn't get much done without these Virgo and Gemini midheavens. And I find that Virgo Gemini midheavens, their strength is the attention to detail that maybe not many other people even want to pay attention to, right? Very detail oriented people in a way that, they might do the work of the project. They have that gift that nobody even wants to do, right? They're meant to be those people who take up space in the realm of the details, right? The power of the authentic voice. Mercury really connects to the throat chakra for me. So maybe some Gemini and Virgo midheavens are especially meant to take up space in the realm of the throat chakra, speaking their truth, podcasting, making videos, being involved in the media, and maybe even speaking out about taboo subjects or talking about things that make people uncomfortable. Because Virgo and Gemini midheavens, being ruled by Mercury, they have that gift of bringing attention to perhaps a subject or a set of data that nobody really wants to look at sometimes, right? And note taking. Okay, I know that sounds really trivial, but it's not, because note taking isn't just about literally taking notes. I think Virgo and Gemini midheavens are constantly the ones who are taking these mental notes about strategies and what has worked in the past and what will work in the future, and how they have what they have observed through other people doing the same thing. And there's this really powerful way that Virgo and Gemini midheavens store data, that's really inspiring, right? So you're probably thinking, I should get myself a Virgo or Gemini midheaven to help me on my next project. And you should, because these people, that's where they're meant to take up space. That's where they thrive. And I also think there's something about like the connection to current events, or the connection to what is trendy is maybe the wrong word, but maybe like what is in style or what is popular, the connection to pop culture, and the timing of that. There's something about Virgo and Gemini midheavens. They kind of have this sixth sense, I feel, about what is going to become popular, or like they tend to be trendsetters, but that's because they have the data of the trends stored in the back of their minds, right? So they're like, I feel like they know, like, okay, this is coming, or I see this trend coming from beneath the surface. Let's do something like that. Like, for instance, let's say we have a fashion designer who's a Gemini midheaven. They may have like this intuitive feeling and this inherent connection to the timing of it all. They may just kind of feel like, oh, yep, this season the 60s are back in, and they end up setting that trend for the rest of the people, just because they're so connected to divine timing in a lot of ways, right? And of course, Mercury being the messenger god, very much, Virgo, Gemini, midheavens could very much be connected to delivering information to other people, right? Okay, so let's take a look at a famous Gemini midheaven. So this is the chart of Hugh Hefner. We could talk a lot about this chart. And he has a Gemini midheaven ruled by Mercury in Aries in the 8th house. Okay, so Hugh Hefner was the founder and creative chief of Playboy Enterprises. So most popularly known for Playboy magazine, right? But I think, what people might not realize about the story of Hugh Hefner is that Playboy wasn't always just about publishing pictures of nude women, right? Like, it wasn't always this kind of that wasn't the only impetus behind Hugh Hefner's creative force behind this magazine. What Hugh Hefner really wanted to do with Playboy when he was inventing it in the 1950s, he wanted a place to actually explore taboo subjects. Yes, did these taboo subjects have to do with nudity? Sure. But historically, some of the articles that Playboy has published, even in the 1960s, Playboy would publish some very, at the time, perhaps some um, really liberal views of the civil rights movement, right? Playboy magazine would explore topics related to sex and shame that is associated with, exploring sexuality. And there's just something about that, like the Mercury in the 8th house, someone who is taking up space in the realm of taboo subjects, um, and cataloging, right? The making of a magazine, collecting data, organizing, being like the editor in chief, the original editor in chief of this magazine, and being the creator of it, knowing what trends were going to be popular and knowing what the readers really wanted to see. It's a very Gemini midheaven ruled by Mercury in Aries in the 8th house kind of way to take up space, right? And, you know, from what I've read too, Hefner was also known to be like very nitpicky. And he like, he like knew what he wanted. He knew what he liked. He was a highly critical person. And that I think also relates to the fact that Mercury isn't just the ruler of Hefner's midheaven, it's also the ruler of Hefner's whole chart because his ascendant is in Virgo. So this Mercury placement has, yes, a lot to do with what Hefner ended up being known for, right? But also it has to do with Hefner's dharma, right? And, we could also talk about shared resources, other people's money, having, multiple girlfriends at a time who all had like allowances. And, there's definitely some shared resources kind of stuff that Hugh Hefner ended up being known for. And of course, we could also look at Uranus and Pisces conjunct the descendant, again, this is going to be another point where this becomes really visible. But overall, I think that Mercury and Aries in the eighth house really sticks out when we're talking about what this person is known for, right? Okay. Venus. So this is for my Taurus and Libra midheavens. The planetary ruler of your midheaven is Venus, right? And what does Venus want to do as the planetary ruler of the midheaven? Well, Venus is about craftsmanship, the creation of beauty, but also she's deeper than that. Venus tends to be really good at negotiation and mediation. I really like to think about Venus as the diplomat. And what does it mean to be a diplomat? A diplomat is literally someone who bridges like two cultures together. They have this understanding of one culture and the other, and they're able to be the mediator or the bridge of these two cultures. If you think of, if you travel internationally and you visit an embassy, just like the act of having like an embassy in a different of your home country in a different country, there's something very Venusian about that because it's bridging the cultures together and you know making sure that there's harmony between differences. So this tends to be perhaps what the Venus midheaven, the Venus ruled midheaven tends to be known for, is called to take up space with, being that person who has the gift of mediation and negotiation. And that can be a creation of beauty, right? I mean, of course, Taurus and Libra midheavens, of course, we have some artists, musicians, photographers. We do have people creating literal art, but I also think we can create beauty by being the person who's really good at disarming conflict, or being the person who's really good at kind of helping people work through their differences. That's a creation of beauty too, right? So I think also the Taurus Libra midheaven, they have this connection to the deeper energy behind surface level aesthetics, right? And that's why everybody admires the way Venus can organize and can decorate a room. It's not just about the interior design skills, but it's also about the energy in which the Venusian person hangs the painting, lays the rug out, chooses the color of the bedspread. It's like a dance. And I think Venus creates beautiful things not just because of their ability to choose beautiful things at the store, but because of the energy they put in behind it. Like they can make a very simple thing beautiful just because of the way they energize it. Okay. And also, I think there's something about love, really simply, like something about Venus as the ruler of the midheaven. The person might be here to promote love or promote some kind of universal understanding of what love is. So, who doesn't love a Venus ruled midheaven? um, so my Venus ruled midheaven here is Anthony Bourdain, who you probably know as the famous chef and TV host of, the Travel Channel's program called No Reservations. So I think that we look here, Anthony Bourdain, he has his midheaven at 0 degrees Taurus, ruled by Venus in Gemini in retrograde in the 11th. And I think that's a really interesting placement because seeing Anthony Bourdain travel and have this passion for international cuisine. Yes, it's about the food, which, yeah, it could be a Taurus thing, right? Taurus midheaven. He's known to be a chef, known to be involved in the culinary arts. Um, for Anthony Bourdain, from what you see from, his past TV productions and videos and things like that, his travels and his exploration of other cultures was so much more than just about food. I wouldn't go as far as to call him a diplomat, but I think when we do sit down in another country and, introduce ourselves and eat this other person's food that they're offering us, what we do is we create a relationship between two people who have differences. And I think Anthony Bourdain really recognized food as this like mediating device. If we can have a meal together, we can create some sense of understanding between each other. And if I like accept your food and I like your food and I think it's delicious, this creates like some kind of rapport between us when we previously didn't really know each other, right? Um, and even I mean, I'm not a Taurus midheaven, but I've had experiences, internationally with other people where like I didn't really speak the same language as some people that I was like with, or and I would just eat with them and we'd have a great time, right? Like you don't need to speak the same language as someone to share a meal with them and connect with their energy. And I think that is a really beautiful thing that Anthony Bourdain offered the world. And I have this picture here. Hopefully it's not getting cut off, but I have that, famous picture of Anthony Bourdain and Obama eating at the, I think it was like a restaurant in Vietnam, I think Hanoi, um, and which is kind of a big thing. I think that's a very diplomatic moment, right? For an American chef and an American president, sharing a beer and a you know, a bowl of pho, like, in Vietnam, a place where historically, America has done, a great amount of damage. And that's an understatement, to be able to be there in the culture and break bread in this Vietnamese restaurant with the Vietnamese people. It's a very Venusian thing, right? It's a very Venusian thing. So I think that's really beautiful. So, okay, let's get into Mars. So my Aries and Scorpio midheavens, how are you meant to take up space in this world? Well, I think there's something about, the Mars ruled midheaven. I think there's something about risk taking and fear facing. Mars is really good at taking risks and facing fears and kind of trekking through the uncharted territory. And I think oftentimes Mars ruled midheaven people end up creating their own path. Like they're just like, well, screw this. Like I want to go this way, and if 100 people are going to the left, I'm going to the right. And I'm taking the hard way. And even though it's the hard way, it's my way, right? There's kind of this connection to, claiming ownership maybe over the path. Um, and I put here like ruffling feathers and irritating the energy that is ready to come to the surface. I don't mean that in a way to say that Aries and Scorpio midheavens are irritable. Um, I I have an Aries midheaven, so I'm laughing. But if you think about just like irritation, like take it away from like a personality or an annoyance kind of connotation, and just think about like going to the allergist or something, and maybe they're testing you for allergies, and they're like putting all these different allergens on your skin, and they're irritating your skin in a way to see what the problem is. And they say, okay, oh yeah, here we go, you broke out in a rash here where we injected you with grass pollen. That's kind of what Mars does in a way. Mars is able, as the midheaven ruler, is able to irritate in order to bring things to the surface so problems can find a resolution. Now, is Mars going to be the one who finds the resolution? Maybe not. Maybe Mars is going to irritate something and then hand it off to Venus, right? But still, it doesn't mean that Mars has no diplomatic or problem solving skills. But I think Mars, there's something about locating the issue or locating the problem and being able to point it out to people really quickly is something that Mars is, I think, really good at. Even if you think of, let's say, a doctor who has a Scorpio midheaven, they may be the doctor that's able to say, oh, yeah, it's this. This is what's wrong with you. When you've been to literally 10 different doctors and they all had no idea what was causing your back pain. And somehow, the Scorpio midheaven ruled by Mars, they're able to ask the right questions and sort of dig in and kind of irritate the situation in a way where they're able to bring the thing to the surface, right? So just an example that came to me off the top of my head. I also think, although we associate Mars with war, I think Mars ruled midheavens, what they sometimes are known for is assessing the worthiness of the battle. I don't think um, Aries or Scorpio midheavens are looking for a fight, or looking for a battle. Certainly, they could be known for that in this lifetime. But more often than not, I think they're more known for knowing like what is worthy of my energy, what is worthy of our fight, and what is actually not worthy of my energy, and what should I walk away from, right? They could just be natural people teaching us how to kind of set boundaries with what we're willing to fight for, right? And knowing the heart of the mission, right? Really connecting to the mission, whatever the mission is. That's a very Mars ruled midheaven kind of thing, connecting to the energy of the why. Why are we even doing this? Why are we even launching this project? Why are we even working on this presentation? Why am I even filming this video right now, right? Like the Aries Scorpio midheaven is really like connected to the why, and that becomes their catalyst to keep moving forward. Okay. So also, there's probably going to be themes of teamwork and competition in the lives of Scorpio and Aries midheavens, maybe a little bit of both. And also, I think because of that, Scorpio and Aries midheavens being ruled by Mars, they're probably going to be known for like defining and redefining winning, and what does it mean to win? What does it mean to be successful? This is probably something that they're, you know, claiming, or they're bringing up a new idea, or they're making a point somehow about this in their lifetime. Okay. So We've got good old Tyra Banks. We all know Tyra is a supermodel and the creator of America's Next Top Model, right? And let's look at Tyra's midheaven, which is at 4 degrees Aries. And we see that the moon is also in Aries, conjunct the midheaven, right? But we see both the midheaven and the moon answering to that Mars, right? That Mars in Aries in the 10th house. And if we want to look at the essential dignities, well, Aries is the domicile of Mars. So we know that this Mars is extra strong. And the 10th house, is a very visible house. So, wow, is this Mars going to be visible in this lifetime for this person? And probably what they end up being known for. And what is Tyra Banks known for the most? It's the creation of the show America's Next Top Model, which is a competition show, right? But also, I have to say, as a person who's a fan of the show, who's watched every single season, probably multiple times, I think there is some kind of mothering energy that Tyra brings, especially maybe in maybe seasons like 1 through 4, like before the show really, really got super big. I think there is this energy that Tyra brings to the contestants of the America's Next Top Model, where she really mothers them and guides them and mentors them into this new territory of modeling. And Tyra herself, I think, went to Paris alone when she was like 16 or 17. It might even have been earlier in her life, but she really pioneered her own path as a Black woman in the modeling industry. And, she became, I think, the first Black woman to be on the cover of a Victoria's Secret catalog, amongst other things. And, she was really a new energy that the modeling industry wasn't used to. And a story that Tyra tells on America's Next Top Model is about when she used to be, when she was younger, in a really like high fashion runway modeling, right? Where you have to be a certain size. But when she hit like in her early 20s, she started to become more voluptuous and maybe gain some weight. And she could no longer have she was no longer the size that she was, set up for her to run or to walk these really high-end fashion shows. So she had to pioneer a new path for herself, and that's when she started modeling for Victoria's Secret, where she could be this voluptuous, curvy woman. She didn't have to be a size 0 twig to walk these high fashion Paris runways anymore. She pioneered this entirely new path for herself. And she keeps doing that, right? Like throughout her entire life, she just keeps going into new paths. Like she just keeps I don't know, clearing the way for herself. And even after modeling, she creates her TV show, America's Next Top Model. And even after America's Next Top Model, she starts to host the Tyra Banks show, which is a talk show, right? And I think it's just really, ties back to that Aries, that Mars ruled midheaven, this fighter, this sort of, I'm willing to pioneer my true passion and bring it forward and fight for what I want. And if someone tells me no, like these runway shows are telling me I can no longer model for them because I have too much curviness to my body. Like, okay, well, I'm going to invent a new path forward and I'm going to make even more money and become even more famous, right? So it's a very much a Mars ruled midheaven kind of thing. And I also think that really famous moment in America's Next Top Model when if you're a fan of the show, when Tiffany leaves and you have that scene where Tyra gets like kind of emotional and she says, I was rooting for you. We were all rooting for you. How dare you? Like, that whole scene. Oh my God. Like, can you think of anything more, midheaven moon, Mars and Aries in the 10th house? Like, we saw that mothering, that like angry mother bear wanting to fight for her children or her contestants in the show, saying, I rooted for you. I cleared the path for you. And you're not recognizing it. It's a very Aries, like that passion behind the Aries, Mars, midheaven. So I thought that was really beautiful. And of course, we have the trine between Neptune and the moon. And I think that really has to do with modeling as well. So we could talk about this chart a lot, but that's what I have for us today. Okay, so let's get into Jupiter. We now have the Sagittarius and Pisces midheavens being ruled by Jupiter. And now we're talking about how Jupiter takes up space, how Jupiter claims their divine, land in this world. And I like to think Jupiter as like the keeper of the universal laws. And Jupiter really is that student of life or eternal questioner. There's this, one of my favorite, you know, lines in the Bible is lean not unto thine own understanding, right? Like, don't lean on what you know or what you think you know, right? Like, lean on what you don't know. And I think that's something that really comes natural to the Jupiter ruled midheaven. There's something about these people, they're meant to take up space in all the places that, the answer is not available, right? I think we'll see probably a lot of astrologers even having Sagittarius and Pisces midheavens because astrologers know that the quest of knowledge is always continuing. We never are finished with our studies. So people who really take up space with their love of learning, their love of knowledge, their love of interacting with different cultures and different, uh, ways of seeing life, right? And I think one of the most important ways Jupiter takes up space in the natal chart is Jupiter's ability to renew our faith and hope during dark times. That's a really important role in the sort of Jupiterian midheavens life. It reminds me, I'm gonna butcher the quote, but in the movie The Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, I haven't seen it in a while because it's just a little too sad for me. But there's that famous quote that it's like, the poetry is what we live for. Um, again, I'm butchering it, but you feel me when I'm saying, like, this is kind of the Jupiterian speaking in a way. Like, what are the things that us humans live for in all of the struggles and the suffering that our earthly lives may have for us to experience? The Sagittarius Pisces midheaven is able to show people the light forward, right? And that's really important. And also teaching others how to co-create with God. We could call this manifestation. We could just call this like being intuitive and being connected to our higher selves. I think there's something about the Sagittarius Pisces midheaven being ruled by Jupiter. They really do know, I think, how to awaken something inside of someone else, to remind people of their own inherent divinity because they themselves are really, they are comforted by their own knowledge of their own divinity, right? And they kind of want people to see the divinity around them. So I think it's a really important thing for Jupiter to take up space in this way. Because if Jupiter ruled midheavens, if they do choose to take up their sacred space, I think out of everybody, they might have the most potential to inspire and to bring light to people during dark times, right? So let's get into our Jupiter ruled midheaven example. And here I have the chart of Mitch Horowitz. And he gave me permission to use his chart for teaching purposes. So thank you so much, Mitch, for donating your chart to astrological purposes. I appreciate it. And Mitch actually wrote one of my favorite books on manifestation, and it's called The Miracle Club: How Thoughts Become Reality. And this has become really the only book on manifestation that I really consider, and also a book on manifestation that, really the only one I feel comfortable recommending to anyone. Because, in the past couple years, or even longer, I think something that a lot of the spiritual community has pointed out is the issue with spiritual bypassing in some of the ideas that go with, like, the law of attraction, and this idea that our thoughts create a reality, and this is said to be the absolute truth. However, it doesn't take into account things like trauma and systematic oppression and racism, and all of the things that can influence our really our ability to obtain the things that we need, right? So that's why this book, for me, Mitch really does a justice to talking about all of these topics and how they relate to manifestation. And and that's why this book, highly recommend it if you're looking for an actually like a good manifestation book that doesn't spiritually bypass. This is your book. And like a true Sagittarius midheaven, Mitch does a lot of different things, right? And I find that to be, the Jupiter ruled midheaven person typically has a lot of, has a lot of eggs in a lot of different baskets, is sort of this jack of all trade, because they might get a little bit bored with just focusing on one thing. It's important for especially for the Sagittarius midheaven, to show up in a way that's extremely versatile and flexible. And I think sometimes Sagittarius midheavens become known for their versatility and their ability to almost be the chameleon of many different talents and exist in many different maybe career paths, or many different clubs, or if you will. So not only is Mitch an author, but to my point about doing a lot of different things, he's also a writer, a speaker, a teacher, and he's actually, I think, probably most popularly known as an occult historian. He also wrote a book called Occult America that kind of is, I haven't gotten to read it yet, but I've heard really good things about how it kind of documents just how spooky some of the history of America is, or has yeah, truly. And there's the seances in the White House, and stuff like that. So if you're into like the secret history of America, definitely look into Mitch Horowitz's occult history work. But okay, let's actually look at the ruler though of Mitch's Sagittarius midheaven, which is Jupiter in Gemini in the 5th house. Okay, so how is Mitch taking up space in this lifetime? Well, let's dial it back and just kind of go back to the basics of the essential dignities. Jupiter is in its detriment in Gemini, right? And not only is Jupiter in its detriment in this chart, Jupiter is also opposite the house of its joy, right? Because Jupiter finds the most joy in, in the 11th house, which is the house of good spirit, right? So it's interesting to take note of both those things, that in this chart, we have Jupiter in its detriment in Gemini, and we also have Jupiter opposite the house of its joy. So it's kind of cool. We already have our wheels turning about what this could mean. And I think Mitch is a really good example of like someone who does have a planet in detriment in their chart, but it's actually what makes them great, right? And I don't think planets in their fall or detriment are at all like, this curse, bestowed upon us by the universe or anything like that. I think the more that we mature and get older too, the more these planets really become our strength and our uniqueness and the way we end up being known, right? And I think Jupiter in its detriment, in the fifth house especially, maybe we're going to be examining this idea of faith in this lifetime. Because remember, we just talked about, how is Jupiter meant to take up space? Jupiter is sometimes teaching others how to co-create with God. And in order to co-create with God, we do need to kind of study the art or the science behind having faith and having a belief in a higher power. And that is so much of Mitch's work, really grappling with this idea of, the fact that like humans and gods are inherently connected, and we are our own gods, and we also are connected to the universe, and sometimes there's a big human struggle with that, right? And I think we all, even the most devout monk or the most devout priest, will have these sort of challenges with belief and challenges with faith in their life in some way. So I think there's something about Mitch's work that really speaks to the human's inherent challenge with believing in a higher power, but also, as much as it is challenging, I think there's something about humans having this innate understanding that there is a higher power. But again, that's actually my Jupiter speak too. So keep that in mind. So a lot of Mitch's work also is about kind of reteaching this notion of the new age or new thought movement, which are really, again, these occult or I guess esoteric movements that really just speak to the human's power to create one's own reality, right? So I would say that Mitch is probably, I consider him an expert on the work of Neville Goddard, who is a sort of famous New Thought philosopher or New Thought thinker. And a lot of Mitch's ideas kind of are inspired by Neville, what Neville wrote, for better or for worse, right? And I think it's interesting to Mitch had this in his Instagram bio, but this quote from the Huffington Post said Mitch has a rare gift of making the esoteric accessible to the discerning masses. Okay, can we just take a minute, like a moment of silence for that? Because we have the midheaven in the 11th house, someone who is speaking to the masses. And also, I think someone who can speak to the skeptic is really something that Mitch is gifted in my opinion, maybe part of his soul's agenda in this lifetime, or maybe it's part of what his soul is really good at. And again, I think that's him taking up space in the realm of Jupiter in the fifth house in Gemini. A lot of his work does sometimes speak to skeptics or people who are discerning, right, of the woo-woo kind of stuff. And it's not to say that he's I don't think he's trying to like convince anybody or argue his point at all. It's more about being this, having this energy of accessibility. So even if you do not consider yourself, into the woo, there's something about, I think Mitch's work that might actually, have you thinking about God or your own innate powers and your own ability to create your reality. Okay, so I think it's such a interesting manifestation here with that Jupiter at its anaretic degree in the fifth house. And when we get into the root of the fifth house, yeah, the fifth house is about romance, pleasure, joy, children. But also, I think the fifth house is about our uniqueness, who we are as individuals. If the 11th house is about how we interact with groups and our networks and our friends, the fifth house is our individual creations, right? So that's definitely feels to me like a big part of Mitch's work, like how you can individualize your own creations and be your own God, if you will. And that's very fifth house. And I also think this is a quote that comes from the Miracle Club, but Mitch writes, "Belief is the fee of actualization." And I think that's really genius too. And it really speaks to the Jupiter ruled midheaven, right? Jupiter being about the topic of belief. But also, we've got a little bit of like that shadow Jupiter in this chart. And I like this sort of belief is the fee of actualization. It's almost like a very realistic statement about the parameters and the possibilities that can come from our beliefs, right? So, yeah, so I think just a really cool chart example there. And also one more thing we could mention too, that even though Jupiter's in detriment, opposite its joy, Jupiter also has some mutual reception with Mercury. So just going to point that out to anybody who wants to take note of that. This could mean, because of the mutual reception there, maybe, Jupiter in the fifth house becomes more beneficial, right? It kind of gives it some of its juice back, if that makes any sense. Okay. So, Saturn, we arrive at our last planet taking up space. How does Saturn take up space? Well, Saturn, with for the Aquarius and Capricorn midheavens, Saturn's really about making structures and making new foundations, but also dismantling what is no longer working, right? So Aquarius Capricorn midheavens may be known for being able to detect where a new foundation needs to be built, right? And they're probably very gifted at being able to organize and being able to delegate what this new structure should look like for the evolution of society as a whole, right? They're not pointing out, a Saturn ruled midheaven isn't pointing out, what's wrong just to be a jerk, right? Like Saturn ruled midheaven is noticing how society could improve so we can evolve as a species, as humans, as souls, right? Saturn's very deeply connected to how the soul matures and the lessons that we learn and the karma that we work through in this lifetime, right? And I have here knowing that there is expansiveness in limitation. And that's truly like, one of the most powerful gifts that Saturn has taught me. Um, I think Aquarius and Capricorn midheavens are very gifted at looking at limited situations and being able to say, here's how we expand within these parameters, right? Um, so let's say we're in a pandemic, right? And let's say you own a restaurant and you have a Capricorn midheaven, and suddenly you cannot have anybody in your restaurant because of COVID regulations. What is the Capricorn or Aquarius midheaven going to do in that situation? They're probably not going to quit. They're just going to evolve to the situation, and they're good at getting other people on board. They're going to say, okay, can't have people in the restaurant. We're limited there, but let's expand our outdoor space or whatever it is. Think about this. If you have an Aquarius or Capricorn midheaven, how are you talented in seeing where your team, your clients, yourself, your coworkers, your boss even, where are you talented at kind of observing, oh, here's a limit, but here's how we can expand through that limit. And that ultimately becomes what you're known for, right? So, and in doing that, we mature ourselves, we enlighten ourselves, and we challenge our souls to grow. So I think the Saturn ruled midheaven, they become known for challenging the structures in place and perhaps putting in place even better structures, right? Um, so here I have Walt Whitman's natal chart, and Walt Whitman is, known to be the father of free verse poetry, which I'm going to explain in a second. But we can see here, Walt Whitman has his midheaven in Capricorn, 5 degrees Capricorn, ruled by Saturn in Pisces in the 12th house. Okay. So the father of free verse poetry. So what Walt Whitman is really known for is, dismantling the structure of poetic meter, right? Because before Walt Whitman, the majority of poetry was written in a certain pattern, right? Or in a certain form, right? We have the sonnets, the villanelles. It's been a while since I've been in an English class in college. um, but the limerick, the guzzle, we have so many poetic forms, but what Walt Whitman really did for at least American literature was, he was the one of the poets to introduce this idea of free verse. We don't need to write within a specific pattern or within a specific meter. We don't need to write poems with rhymes. And that was actually a very revolutionary idea, right? In like the 1800s, right? So this is the definition of free verse poetry from the Poetry Foundation. So, what is free verse? Non-metrical, non-rhyming lines that closely followed the natural rhythms of speech. A regular pattern of sound or rhythm may emerge in free verse lines, but the poet does not adhere to a metrical plan in their composition. Okay. Um, isn't that so Saturn in Pisces? Like, if we're gonna have Saturn like Saturn ruling the midheaven in Pisces, this is someone who's definitely dismantling a structure, right? It's someone who's inventing a new way forward. And, with Saturn being in the 12th house, Walt Whitman being who he was, a complicated individual with questionable, questionable thoughts, right? When it comes to his, the things he said with his political opinions, and how he kind of went back and forth with what he really thought about the abolitionist movement and things like that. We could go into other things about his life, but I also think the 12th house is kind of about maybe some of the enemies or some of the hardships that followed him dismantling or attempting to dismantle like uh, Western poetry, essentially. So, like, he was fired from his job after his famous book Leaves of Grass was published because, like, the ideas, especially like the like homoeroticism within the Leaves of Grass composition was seen to be offensive, right? So that's the thing. Maybe sometimes Saturn ruled midheavens, maybe they offend, or maybe they dismantle something. But we have to remember that people aren't happy with us when we dismantle a previous foundation. People tend to be very attached to their foundations and tend to be very attached to, you know, what is considered normal. So when you try to unnormalize what is normal, we're always going to be met with people who perhaps do not like us or don't like what we're trying to do, how we're trying to dismantle the system, right? Um, so I think this is a really interesting thing. I also think Saturn being really close to Pluto, I think it really speaks to maybe Walt Whitman's influence on really generations to come, right? Okay, so to end today's class, if you're still with me, I thought we would end with some poetry and to just further explore Whitman's midheaven ruler as Saturn in Pisces in the 12th. I wanted to actually read one of his poems, but also compare and contrast the free verse of Whitman to something um, very metrical, to a famous form of poetry called the Limerick, which was made famous by the poet Edward Lear in the Book of Nonsense. So the Limerick is a form of poetry that always has 5 lines, one stanza, and follows an AABBA rhyme scheme. Okay, so you can see, oh, this is a poem with a structure, right? And of course, like I mentioned before, there are other types of poems with other types of structures. The sonnet, the ballad, the villanelle. We could name probably 100 different forms of poetry, right? But the whole point about writing in a form is you are following a structure, right? So I want you to just maybe listen to these limericks by Edward Lear, and I want you to just even listen with your ears, and or like see with your ears if that makes sense, and let your ears show you the structure that Lear kind of organized with these limericks. Okay, so and these are just silly. His limericks are also known to be kind of silly and sometimes outrageous. um, so there was a young lady whose bonnet came untied when the birds sat upon it. But she said, I don't care, all the birds in the air are welcome to sit on my bonnet. Okay, so you hear the A A B B A rhyme scheme there, right? And we see how the poem begins in the last line, the last word of the first line and the last word of the last line are the same, which is also a signature of the limerick. Okay, and one more here. There was an old man with a beard who said, it is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in my beard. Okay, so again, it's like there was a blah 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 blah. Like you hear you hear the song, right? Like the rhythmic kind of quality of a limerick, right? So this is a very basic example of a poem with a form. Okay, now let's go to Whitman, right? Capricorn Midheaven, ruled by Saturn and Pisces in the 12th. So he's dismantling a lot of these poetic forms, and he's saying, I'm not going to write in these forms anymore. I'm writing in a free verse. So again, with the power of your ears, listen into just how different this poem sounds to something more structured like the Limerick. Okay, America by Walt Whitman. Center of equal daughters, equal sons, all alike, endeared, grown, ungrown, young or old, strong, ample, fair, enduring, capable, rich, perennial with the earth, with freedom, law, and love, a grand, sane, towering, seated mother, cherid in the adamant of time. Okay. Yeah, so let that soak in because, again, did you hear any structure? Did you hear any rhyme? Did you hear any meter? No. Okay. So you just kind of heard the sound of Saturn and Pisces. So I hope you enjoyed that little poetry lesson just to wrap everything up. And I had so much fun being your teacher today. Thank you so much to Stormie Grace for allowing me the space to make this presentation about the midheaven. And I hope that I helped you learn something new about your own midheaven placement. And I have all of my social media up on the screen, so you can follow me if you want on Instagram, Twitter. I also have a YouTube channel. And if you like the presentation, you can head on over to my podcast, which is called the Witch Church Podcast, available on all podcast platforms. And there I talk about astrology, but I also talk about things like tarot and witchy stuff and really all things spiritual. So thank you so much, everybody.